Hey everyone, Rob B here with Rob D, and you are listening to the Property Podcast, a very special episode of the Property Podcast because we have reached the milestone of episode 500.
Yes, welcome to episode 500 of the Property Podcast. This is the point of our week where we take time out from advising a multi-million pound property fund and putting together hundreds of deals per year. And as we have done every week for 500 weeks in a row now, brought you some of the knowledge that we've gained along the way for free. So to celebrate making it to this very cool number, we recorded this episode live on YouTube with hundreds of people participating. Thank you so much to everyone who came along and asked questions and made that so fun. In this episode, you're going to hear an edited version of that conversation where we talk about the 5 biggest lessons we've learned from doing this podcast for a decade. We answer questions about the podcast itself and how it's put together. And we answer questions about what is happening in the property market right now.
Now, you are obviously listening to the audio version of this podcast, but if you want to see us and watch this episode, you can do. You can find it on our YouTube channel by searching Property Hub UK. Make sure you subscribe while you're there. And we also know that so much is happening in the market right now. So if you want to keep up to date with what's happening, we have a video on the thumbnail, at least, called What's Happening. And it's a market update where we talk about mortgages, interest rates and house prices. So while you're over on YouTube, check that out. And next week, we'll be back on the pod with answering the big questions that came up from the live episode and from webinars we've done recently. So make sure you join us for next week. But without further ado, let's get to episode 500 live.
All right, we are live.
Well, sis, here we go. Right, let's kick off, Rob, with some slides and some content, because that's what people are here for. Do you want to give a bit of an overview of what we're going to do on this very, very special live episode? And actually, I've got some bubbles. It is water because I'm planning on going to the gym later, but I thought I'd celebrate anyway. So cheers, Rob. Happy 500 episodes.
Cool. So first of all, we're going to do a very quick little bit of 5 lessons that we've learned from putting out 500 episodes of the Property Podcast over the last nearly 10 years. We're then going to take your questions and we're going to take it in 2 different forms. So we're going to start with questions about the podcast and anything you might be curious about there. And then we'll broaden out and talk about questions about the property market in general. So we'll do both of those rounds of questions. So, Rob, 5 lessons from 500 episodes. So the first lesson for me is don't go alone, whatever you do. With the podcast, I don't think it's any coincidence that we both had our own podcasts and we've had them sporadically in the early years and they didn't last. And they didn't last because it relied on us and our motivation and everything to turn up. But the Property Podcast has, because we're accountable to each other. And so we have to turn up every time or it's a bit awkward. So that is what has meant that we haven't missed a single week. And I'm sure, Rob, you could apply this to so many other areas of life and property as well.
Oh, accountability. It's a bit of a recent one for me because, yes, we've kept each other accountable in the pod or on the pod, but it's kind of without realizing. And then I realized in business as well, like those being co-founders for the businesses that we have together. Again, that accountability to not let the other one down, I think has definitely pushed us to do our best in business. But then you started applying it in fitness as well. And then I copied you with most things. So I applied it with business. I mean, recently, just as an example, I've got a Peloton bike and I kind of gone off the wagon with it. I hadn't used it in ages. So I started a accountability challenge with another Rob in our business, Rob Wiggins. And we said, right, let's see how many days in a row we can go, like streaking, and who goes the longest wins. And whoever loses buys the other lunch. So like true accountability. And, you know, we're multiple days in now, and some days I've not wanted to do it. And there's no way I would have done that Peloton ride if I didn't have that accountability on the other side. And there's no way we would have done 500 episodes without missing a single week if we weren't co-hosting together. I know you've said the same, so it's not just that me and I'm not disciplined. There's always something that you could do, but you just don't want to let anyone else down. And I think you can do this in property as well.
Massively, yeah. Whether it's working with an official partner in what you do, or just getting a friend who cares about you to hold you to account, and maybe they're doing something completely different, unrelated to property, whether maybe it's fitness or something else, where they want to be held accountable. You can still do that, even if you're actually both pursuing completely different things. The power of that has been such a driving factor in getting us this far. Number 2, Rob, keep it consistent. And I think turning up and doing something literally every week has played a big part in growing the podcast as big as it has. People love consistency. Consistency is good for you in terms of actually showing up and doing it, but everyone loves consistency. And so the fact that you can rely on the podcast to come out every single Thursday, whatever's going on, whether it's Christmas Day, New Year's Day, whatever it is, we've been through that. The birth of multiple children have happened while the podcast has been going on, and we haven't missed one. That counts for something, because it becomes a fixture that people can rely on. And I think if we sort of like did a bit and then got busy, missed a month, came back and did another one, we wouldn't have got as far as we had. And again, you can apply that anywhere.
Yeah, so like in fitness, it's like if you are disciplined every day or consistent every day with what you do, then that works. And consistency, just that it's that if you can do a little bit, whether it's every day, every week, every month, if you just make progress towards your goals consistently, you're going to be so further ahead. With property, it could be just that you are committed to educating yourself, listening to the podcast. It's a great way of being consistent with your education. You can play it in so many ways, but it's been a massive driver for our success. And yeah, consistency definitely deserves to be one of our key takeaways.
Number 3, just get started. This is another big one. And like when we started the podcast, we love podcasts. We love the idea of it, but we didn't really know what we were doing. We weren't the experts in podcasting, and we weren't massively the experts in property. I mean, we knew a fair bit because we'd been in it for a while when we started, but we know so much more now. There's another actually point on that coming up. But the point is, we didn't wait until we felt that the time was perfect to get started. This, I think, Rob, hugely applies to property, because there's always a reason not to do it now. And we've seen this consistently in terms of news flow, in terms of your personal situation. There's always a reason why now is not the right time, and you should wait and see. And there will be people who've listened to the podcast, I know there are, who've been listening for all these years and still haven't quite brought themselves to get started. And maybe if they got started, they would have made a mistake and it wouldn't have been perfect, but they would have learned so much that they would have been further ahead anyway.
The getting started point is huge. So it's easy to go, well, yeah, but you got the big podcast and it's nearly 400,000 downloads every month, which is bonkers. Thank you for being part of those downloads. But when we started, it probably wasn't even 400. It would have been tiny, right? Because we did a bit of promotion, but we didn't have an audience, and we just started. We started with property investment. We started a business, and it's the same for everybody watching or listening. It's just start. If it's property, if you haven't begun investing yet, just start. Now, if you have the money to invest, then today, this afternoon, or over the weekend, don't make excuses. Set the time, do it, and book in that time, and go and do the viewings and start. That's starting to make progress. Listening to podcasts is not enough. You have to take that action. This could be called take action, but just doing something. If you haven't got the funds to invest yet, then it's like, okay, well, what can I do education-wise? How can I level up? And the fact you listen to the podcast is encouraging, but what else could you do? Have you been to a networking meeting yet? Have you engaged with other property investors in real life? Kind of scary thing, right? But that's going to level you up. Just start doing it. Everything new always seems scary, but most things aren't. Once you've done it, you kind of think, why was I worried about that? Why was I bothered? But when you do it, then you kind of go, okay, great, what's next? And you get that momentum. But starting is so important.
So number 4 is to become an expert, create. So I was saying earlier, when we started, we knew a reasonable amount of property because we'd been investing ourselves and we'd been running property businesses for an amount of time, but we didn't know everything. We still don't know everything, but we know an amazing amount more than we did. Part of that is just because we've been in it for longer. We've now been in it for 10 years longer than we had been. So naturally you gain knowledge. But I'm convinced that what's really driven our knowledge accumulation has been having to turn up and explain it to other people every week. When you have to put something out there and put a point across, whether it's to persuade someone, inform someone, entertain someone, whatever it is, you learn so much more about what it is. You're forced to do the reading in advance. You're forced to think about what you want to do. And by putting together whatever the material is, whether it could be a blog, a podcast, a YouTube video, anything at all, by doing that, you clarify your thoughts so much. And because you're spending more time immersed in it and thinking about it, you start to link up other concepts that otherwise you wouldn't. And so it's the absolute best way for me, Rob, to learn anything is to just create. And that naturally ties back into just getting started, because it's so easy to get put off creation because you're like, oh, well, I don't know everything. I'm not the expert. Well, you get there by creating, by starting. That's the whole point.
Yeah, it can sound intimidating. And, you can put this to property and go, okay, you want to be more of an expert with property or anything in life. If you start creating on it, it'll make a difference. But yes, a podcast is doable. No one has to listen. If you just make the podcast, you'll learn. If you like writing, it could be a blog. It doesn't have to be a book. You don't have to go as extreme as Mr. D. But you could just start really small and just open a Twitter account around your chosen subject and start to give your thoughts and education on that subject. Again, if people don't engage, that's not the entire point. If we had a tenth of the listeners that we have to the podcast, we still would have the same knowledge as we have today because we presented that information. So yes, we've done a lot of doing. Yes, we've done a lot of investing. We've done transactions worth hundreds of millions of pounds worth of deals. But the most knowledge, has really come from nearly as much, if not more so, is by the creating part, by making us think about our experiences and what did we learn from them. Because you can do stuff, but actually when you then document the stuff that you've done and talk about it, you learn so much more because you're forced to think about it.
So we're going to do our fifth point, and then we're going to move on to questions, and we're going to be starting with questions that you have about the podcast itself. I've seen some really good ones coming in already. Keep them coming, and we'll answer those in just a minute. After we've done our fifth point, I think, Rob, you should lead this off because I've done a few. Number 5, don't settle.
Do not settle. Let's focus on the podcast to begin with. So we've never settled with the podcast. So a few years in, it was doing fantastically well. We had a basic editor and we thought, right, that's great. But we didn't settle. We hired a producer and editor, someone who works a lot with us, puts a lot of hours into the podcast with us. And that's helped level it up again. And then this year, the podcast is a top 5 business podcast. But we thought, no, let's level up. Let's not settle. So we went through all our data and went, okay, let's look at what's working here. What have been our most popular episodes? What do people want, basically? And let's do more of that. And we changed around the content the second half of this year. You may have noticed that we're kind of focused on these bigger themes. It's because that's what you want. That's what we get the most reaction to and the most downloads. And our podcast this year has lifted up 20%. So it was already a big number, but it's lifted up another 20%. And that's because we didn't settle. We don't settle in business either because we always want the next big thing. We're always looking for the exciting new goal and we keep pushing ourselves. You can do this in property investment. Like if you've got a portfolio and you're completely happy with it, you don't have to keep expanding, but maybe you just need to improve what you've done. Can you look at the mortgage products? Can you look at the rents that you're charging? What can you do? Don't just get blasé about it all, but maybe you've got your portfolio and you could push that a little bit further. By not settling always means that you push. In Property Hub and Portfolio, we've got a value called constant improvement. And that really relates to this, which is like, we always can improve on everything we do. And we apply that to most areas of our lives. Are we perfect? Far from it. This is not to be confused though with like grinding and just working 24/7. It's not the same. So if we go back to the podcast example of changing the content around, that was a morning's thoughts and conversation and thinking about how we can improve things, and then a couple of days research. So 2.5 days total of effort to lift our podcast by 20%. So it's not that we, put in 50, 60, 70, 80 hours weeks to make the podcast better. We just gave it time, but we didn't settle. And then we gave it some thought and some intellect, hopefully. And then we thought, okay, this is how we can do it. Let's test it. We tested it and it improved. But not settling allows you to constantly improve. And I think that's a good thing to do in life. I think it's always good, at least in one area of life, to always be pushing yourself.
That's right. I think you're completely right to say that it's not the same as just working hard. Like, we're not working 20% harder to grow our numbers by 20%. We're doing the same. But if you took the approach of, well, I just need to do more, I'll put out more podcasts, more content, then that's one way of doing it. But that's not the best way. So our way is just kind of putting in, I suppose, more thought and not being satisfied with where we are, but putting in thought to try to move it to the next level. And I think as well, it's not, you don't have to work ridiculously hard. You don't have to optimize every area of your life all at once. I think it makes sense to have kind of one goal at a time and be optimizing one or maybe two different areas. You can definitely fall into a trap of just trying to, especially when you first get excited about personal improvement, trying to optimize everything all at once. And that's a good way to burn out. So there we go. Those are the 5 things that we picked out that we've learned from 500 episodes of the Property Podcast. Now it's time for questions.
With questions, let's start it off with general questions to begin with. So about the podcast, high level stuff that will be hopefully timeless stuff we can answer. And then, of course, we'll get into the market today because people want to know about that. So we'll prioritize those questions that are coming in that really allow us to do timeless content, evergreen content, as they like to call it. Rob, here's a good one. Did we ever feel any potential backlash from the fake guru community who charge for this type of learning and information? No, there's been the odd little bit, but nothing too sinister. There's been the odd little shots fired, but nothing aggressive, nothing that's bothered us.
No, there was a company or individual who we will not name who was trying to do SEO, like negative SEO, like against my name and sort of making certain insinuations and sort of wrote me a very stroppy email at one point as well. But I think they kind of got the message that we weren't that bothered. Like, the best thing to do is always just ignore it, right? And so we just kind of ignored it, didn't get any attention, didn't escalate it into some big beef, and so it just they kind of gave up. Sadly, I think they're doing perfectly well, and we're not hurting their business in any meaningful way.
Very well not to name them. So tempted.
Before we go on, I think I love the fact that people still don't know which of us is which. It's like we addressed as like Rob without the beard and Rob with the big microphone. we should probably have found a way of getting our names up on screen. Maybe do that next time.
Okay, next. How do you think a newbie can get into property investment, Rob?
That's a really tough question. It always has to come back to goals and what you're trying to achieve. That's always a start to any answer. And it sometimes feels like a bit of a cop-out, but it does, because it's like, well, what are you trying to achieve and what have you got behind you in terms of, are you a newbie, but you've got £1 million? Or are you a newbie and you've got £1,000? They're very different things. So I think the best thing that you can do, for me, I'd be interested in your answer, is always start getting experience as quickly as you can. And so if that experience can be actually going and buying a property, that's awesome. If you can't do that, but you can get a small amount of exposure through a fund, so at least you've got something in it, you're interested in what's happening, and so that kind of causes you to go, oh, why has that happened? Then you kind of go and learning. If you can't do that or you don't want to do that, then just be absorbed in it all the time and keep on learning and trying to speak to people who are doing it, but without falling into the trap of just kind of trying to learn everything before you start. So yeah, that would be the start of my answer, Rob. I don't know if you've got anything to add.
No, I think that's a great answer. It's just it comes back to one of the points, and it's just getting started. Financially, not maybe able to do it, but go and work with another property investor, shadow them, see what they do, ask questions, just build on your knowledge and consistently save as quickly as you can so you can get yourself in that position to invest. I've seen a great way to remember who we are, Rob. Rob B for beard. Rob Beard, Rob B.
Perfect. I'll remember that from now on.
That's a good one. In case you forget who I am.
Richard has asked, which subjects are most popular on the podcast? Interestingly, I'd say there are 2 categories of things that tend to get the best numbers and the most reactions. One is all the macro stuff. So anything that we do to do with inflation and QE and things like that, even if it's not directly related to property. Anything to do with the 18-year cycle, obviously, but also things that aren't actually to do with property. Anything that we do around kind of general self-improvement and mindset kind of topics, we always get really good reactions to those, we're never quite sure whether we should be doing them, because it's like, well, it's not really about property. You can kind of relate it back, but they always do really well.
They do. The podcast related. Why did we stop AOB? truth is we didn't really enjoy making it. And I think that says something, that you should try and do the things that you enjoy. We really, really enjoy creating the property podcast. Like, really enjoy it, obviously, 500 episodes in. AOB was kind of felt like a chore. I think it was because we possibly committed to do it on camera as well, so we had to travel somewhere. That was more effort. I know it makes it sound like we were a bit lazy, but we do have a lot of other things going on. So it was kind of the lack of enjoyment then meant the motivation wasn't there, so we didn't push on with it. We do definitely like talking about business, and we are, maybe let's make an exclusive, Rob, we are very, very tempted to release a new podcast in the future, hopefully in the new year, certainly in the first quarter of next year. You feel free to guess. We won't give it away what it's about yet, but we will go again with another podcast, something that we think we're going to really enjoy recording and in a format that's going to suit us. So yeah, of course, we'll keep you updated on the property podcast when that launches, but we will, I would say 98% certain, launch another podcast next year.
Yeah, and I think it's important that we're learning our lessons from the last one and going, okay, well, whether we enjoy it, that sounds like a selfish thing, but it's really important because that's how you do a good job and do some of those things we talked about earlier in terms of being obsessed with getting better and better. And we're sort of trialing it in advance as well to try and nail it before we get started. Got a funny one from Ben. It says, Rob B, meant Rob D. Oh, he's corrected himself. I know you choose to rent. Does your landlord know who you are and do they listen to the podcast? I'd find it weird if I were your landlord. Actually, I did, when I called up about the property we're renting, the letting agent recognised my voice, which is actually really helpful because there was a lot of competition for getting this property. So I don't know if I'll be able to repeat that every time. Maybe that's a good motivation to grow the podcast, to make sure I'll get recognised by everyone. But that was a bit of a win, and I liked it because in real life, Rob B gets recognised far more than I do. So I take the wins where I can get them.
I think it's just because I go out more.
That could be a factor.
Do we ever disagree? Because we seem to agree on those things. We do agree on those things, actually. I put it down to Rob's patience, probably more than anything. But I think that's important, that we are aligned on kind of values and visions that we have for the podcast and the business. So we don't disagree very often. And when we do, it's just a respectful conversation. When we have a different point of view, which probably isn't often enough, we both get very curious to why the other person doesn't think that way. You know, when Rob doesn't agree with me, I really want to understand why, because I don't want to embarrass him, but he's a super smart guy. So if he doesn't agree with my point of view, then I want to understand his point of view, because at the very least, I'm going to probably learn something, prove my point of view, or change my point of view. So I know that sounds like we're Switzerland and we never argue. We've never got cross with each other, but it's just, that's not what we're like.
I know. It'd be more interesting for the podcast if we disagreed more sometimes. You might have heard us say, I really want to disagree with you on that, but I can't. But I think, yeah, it's always more interesting than we do because it's an opportunity to learn. But I think we're quite similar anyway. That's why we work together well. But also, when you work with someone for a long time, you sort of start merging a little bit. And it's kind of the same in a marriage. Like, people kind of get more similar over time. And, you know, in terms of investment strategy, part of my strategy moving has been influenced by Rob and sort of seeing what he's doing. Going, oh yeah, I see why he's doing and why he's doing it. And yeah, he's right to be doing that. That's why I sort of shifted. And so we've become more similar over time in different ways.
Michael said, please never stop the podcast. Don't worry, just because we're starting a new podcast will not mean we're stopping this podcast. I want to make that clear. We'll carry on. I don't know how many other lives we'll do, but we'll certainly carry on with the normal pod, so do not worry. There's an interesting question from Harry. Given the interest rate for the next year, would you look at capital growth over rental yields? I always look at both, but the one I'm optimizing for is capital growth, because capital growth is where you get the wealth. Rent is the nice bonus top up, your rental profit. The capital growth is where the meaningful wealth is created. And that's where I've, not at the beginning, so I've adjusted my strategy, but certainly over the last few years, I've optimized my personal strategy to take on property investments that hopefully will deliver the most capital growth. And the way to look for those properties is looking for areas that show a lot of value. So often it can be decent rental yields plus very strong fundamentals. So if you find an area that has, you know, quite attractive yields, doesn't have to be like barnstorming, just quite good compared to other places with good fundamentals, like really good fundamentals, then you can go, oh, actually, this place is, you know, got a great opportunity for capital growth. So areas that we've identified in the past that qualify for that would be Manchester. Manchester's absolutely qualify for that, has done amazing. And we talked about Manchester years and years ago before it did. Certainly throw Derby, Liverpool, Nottingham into that batch of places that have incredible fundamentals. But actually, the yields are pretty decent. And normally, when you have decent yields and really, really strong fundamentals, the next step is capital growth. So I personally always optimize for capital growth. Make sure I've got solid rent coming in and cover all the costs to make a bit of a profit. But that's not where the wealth creation is.
James has asked a question about renting versus owning. We'll answer that one in a bit, but I've got another one from Richard who says, is now the wrong time to buy? Should we be waiting for a few months and the likely crash to happen? This is a difficult one. I've actually got a video coming out on a very similar subject next week, so watch out for that one. But obviously, you could look at the situation right now and go, yeah, of course. Clearly, there are lots of reasons why everything could go wrong, and therefore I'll wait and see what happens. The only problem with that is you could have made that argument at multiple different points over the last however many years. So you could have done that with COVID. You could have done it with Brexit. You could have done it when there was the election with Jeremy Corbyn. There are so many reasons that you go, oh, well, something's going to go wrong soon. Therefore, I'm going to wait and see. And there's never a point where everything looks absolutely brilliant forever into the future. And the problem is actually that if there ever is a point when everyone is feeling great about everything, that means something's probably going to go wrong soon. It's the best time to invest is generally when people are nervous. You can get out there and do good deals, but people are thinking the world's going to end, but actually it doesn't. Obviously, the thing is, at some point, things are going to go really wrong. We've talked about that extensively. You know it's going to happen. So it's just a matter of, well, is it going to be now or is it not? And we can't tell you what to do, what you should do, or what you should think. All we can do is give our view of things and tell you about what we're doing personally as well, which we did on the podcast just yesterday. We're talking about how we're buying at the moment. So that's all we can do. And then you have to make up your own mind. But the problem is, it's very easy to go, yes, I should wait, but you can just find yourself waiting forever.
There's a really good question in from Jamie because it allows us to answer two things, actually, which is when the crash comes, how deep do we think it'll be? Will it be, a deep, severe crash, or will it be, a quick recovery? And I think it allows us to say when we think a crash will come, which I think we're, again, in unison when we say that it's a good few years away yet because there's still the boom to happen. And how big the crash will be would be determined by how big the boom is. And that's nearly always the case. If you have a super strong aggressive boom, then you tend to have a super strong aggressive crash. It kind of makes sense, right? So time will tell. Anybody who's going to start predicting on how deep or shallow the next crash will be doesn't have a clue. None of us do. It's going to depend on how big this boom ends up being. And the government, I think, wants a boom. I think that's what they tried to start with the recent budget. Let's not go into that in too much detail. It may have not worked so far, but that's their intent. Stamp duty, the changes there. What does that suggest? Well, that suggests that they want a very strong property market, even though it's up. It depends on which data set you use, but at least 8% so far this year. So the property market's done incredibly well this year. It's softened a little bit, didn't crash, didn't drop, just softened. And the government went in straight with a stamp duty cut. I think that tells you everything you need to know about what they want to happen to property prices over the coming years. And if that happens, and if we go into a boom, an aggressive boom, then unfortunately we'll have an aggressive crash. And if we have a modest boom, we'll have a modest crash. So I'm not one for big boom and busts, a bit like Gordon Brown. But unlike Gordon Brown, I don't think it's the end of boom and busts. I think that there are more to come and will always come because of human nature.
So there's quite a lot of different questions around mortgages, and sort of, I suppose if I bucketed them, it would sort of be like, mortgages are getting more expensive. Does that mean property values have to come down? And what should I be doing with mortgages given where rates are? There's a few different things to say about this. We talked about this bit on a webinar that we did last night, and we'll probably end up doing something on the podcast about it soon. But the important thing at the moment, mortgage rates are all over the place at the moment because no one knows what's going to happen. So expectations of future interest rates have changed really rapidly after the mini budget. And as a result, nobody's got a lot of visibility. Lenders need to know what's going to be happening over the coming years for their fixed rate products, and they don't. So they pulled all their products. They're in the process of bringing them back. Where they come back, nobody really knows. What's going to be important is where the base rate ends up settling. So there's lots of predictions around this. Like there's predictions about it being 6% by the middle of next year, maybe, but nobody knows. Nobody has a clue. Everyone who tries to predict these things ends up being wrong. I've been wrong about the base rate, but it's really hard to know. So the important thing to know for now is that at the moment, we're just in a bit of a pause where we just don't know where rates are going to settle. They're very clearly going to settle higher than they have been in the past. The base rate has been close to zero for years. Mortgage rates have been extremely cheap for years. So they were only ever going to go in one direction. And I don't think they're going to come back down to where they were before. We're just in a different era now. But it's a case of where they settle. And are we suddenly going to see runaway interest rates? I don't think we are. But I think in terms of what you should do at the moment, like, should you be doing anything right now? Should you be fixing? We've said on the podcast recently, if you can, the best thing to do now is nothing. And in terms of just wait to see where things settle down. And in terms of how long should you be fixing for, I can see the argument for doing a long-term fix. But if you're doing it right now, it's possibly a bad time to be doing that, because you're locking in a pretty unkind rate when there are lots of factors pointing to the fact that actually it's going to get better over the next couple of years. So I've previously said, like, I'd fix for 5 years, slightly tongue-in-cheek, because it means I can't be bothered to deal with it after 2 years. But my view has changed over the last couple of weeks because of everything that's been going on. And I now think that it's probably best to maintain some flexibility, because yes, there is a risk that rates will go up further, but I'd say on balance, it's more likely that the situation right now will settle down and they will come down from where they are now. Not down to where they were, but down from what's available right now.
It's a good question in from Craig. He's got 80k to invest, and how should he get started? So once you've established your goals and your strategy, and let's just, it doesn't matter what your strategy is. You get your goals, your strategy. There's lots of different strategies you can go for. But once you've done that, for me, it's don't overthink it. It comes back to one of our points earlier in this podcast, which was get started. Your first investment, you will probably regret or critique more than any other in years to come, because you'll look at it and go, oh, well, that's not right. I had this idea of a goal and a strategy, but it's adapted and changed, and actually it wasn't the best pick. Don't worry about that. Like, by starting, you're progressing, because you'll learn those lessons and you'll become more informed as an investor by the doing. The great thing about property investment is, in the vast majority of cases, unless it's a nightmare situation, in the vast majority of cases, you get rewarded anyway. You might not get as much capital growth and you might not get as much rental profit, but you still, over time, should get both. And in terms of learning, that's the best type of learning, right? You still get rewarded over the long term. So don't overthink it. Action is important. Get started. You're not looking for perfect. You're looking for good enough. And once you've found an investment that's good enough and you're off the mark, then the real education starts.
Mitesh has asked, do you think the rental market will ease off as house prices fall? I don't think the rental market will ease off, because if we're talking about house prices falling, for a start, no one has any idea what's going to happen with house prices. If we do see falls from where we are now, which is entirely possible, then I think we've talked about the 18-year cycle. We did our most recent episode on where are we in the cycle. All that still applies. Any falls that we get from here are going to be pretty minor. And even if you got a fall that was pretty major, it doesn't mean everyone's suddenly going to become a homeowner and be doing that instead of renting. Because the thing is, whenever you do get a big crash, whenever that does come, it becomes a really difficult time to actually buy, because it's really hard to get mortgages. So any kind of change in terms of the balance of owners and renters is going to take a long time to happen. It's not going to happen suddenly. There are lots of factors that are supporting the rental market being very strong. So rental growth over the last year has been absolutely nuts. I don't think it's always going to be that nuts, but I do think it's going to continue to be very strong.
My next question I'll pick up is around diversification. I've seen a couple of questions on this, on how do you diversify in property and how do we diversify it with our investments. So in property, there are a few ways to diversify. So one way to diversify is doing different strategies. I personally don't like that, because it's more work. Because you may be invested in property, but they are so different and require different energy, effort, and it's actually very little duplication other than them being both property investment strategies, there's very little in common, which helps you. So, for example, if you do professional buy-to-let, it's kind of more set and forget. If you did that also with holiday lets, which is quite intensive, they're very different things. It's a way of diversification within property, but it's not one that I personally would choose. The way Rob and I both diversify is to choose different locations and different property types. So we both have a mix of houses and apartments, and we both have a mixture of areas that we invest in as well. So if a particular area does well, then we benefit from that, but that also compensates for an area that is underperforming. Now, when you start, I appreciate that is, really difficult. And, that's why you put all your eggs in one basket and you kind of feel under pressure to get it right. But as I've already said, just starting is better than doing nothing, and you'll learn those lessons, and it doesn't have to be the best investment ever. So that's a way of diversifying wealth and investment in general. I know it's pretty similar for you, Rob, but our kind of diversification is poor because the amount of money you need to put into property is vast in most cases. So because of that, you become imbalanced with where your wealth is allocated it, then it's probably a lot of IFAs would look at it and go, I don't like that your balance, your mix there. But we are investing in something that we are probably experts at and know very, very well. And I'd rather invest in something I'm an expert at than invest in something that I kind of have a passing knowledge of.
Yeah, there's a lot to be said for diversification, but the typical advice that you get is sort of for if you want typical results. And so maybe you don't want typical results. If you want to do better than that and you feel like you've got an edge in something or you've got knowledge of something, then it makes sense to be imbalanced while being aware, of course, of the risk you're taking and not being unaware of that. But one of the great things about property is that we invest for the long term, right? So capital values could bounce around all over the place, but the rental income is always going to be there. And so that certainly helps, because what the portfolio is worth today is of no consequence whatsoever. Maybe in 30 years' time it will be, but today it's not.
Okay, well, thank you, everyone. That's absolutely flown. Thank you so much for joining us. We didn't know if this was going to be like crickets or whatever. Like, it's inconvenient for people to join us. So thank you for taking your time out to join us today and helping us celebrate episode 500. I'll get my Sparkling and Water out once again. Cheers, Rob. Happy 500.
Happy 500.
This podcast will be well edited and will sound probably half decent by Thursday. So thank you, producer Dan, for all you do. And thank you once again for joining us today. Do check out the market update video after this. It'll get you up to speed with everything that's going on in the market right now. And yeah, make sure you subscribe, because we do have some brilliant videos coming up. We recorded one earlier today, so there's some amazing content to come as well. And of course, we'll be back next Thursday with the Property Podcast. So until then, take care, have fun. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.